The day Perturabo turned against the Emperor did not begin with betrayal. It began with silence. No thunder split the sky above Terra. No legion banners burned. No vox grills screamed defiance. The Lord of Iron did not rage, did not declare, did not kneel before the ruinous powers and swear oaths. He simply stopped believing that the Imperium deserved to endure. In the vast machinery of the Great Crusade, that moment passed unnoticed. Another compliance logged, another fortress reduced, another world reshaped to fit a vision that no longer asked whether the stone itself wished to stand. Perturabo had built too much to believe in accidents. He understood pressure, load, fatigue. He knew how structures failed. Not all at once, but quietly, from flaws ignored because they were inconvenient to acknowledge. The Imperium, he realized, was such a structure, and the Emperor, for all his brilliance, had chosen to ignore the fractures that mattered most. This is not the story of a sudden fall to chaos. It is the story of a primarch who measured the Imperium honestly and found it wanting. If you're drawn to the darker, more tragic corners of Warhammer 40k lore, where loyalty erodes under silence rather than fire, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes every traitor began as a monster. It helps the channel endure and ensures stories like this keep being told. Perturabo learned early that the galaxy rewarded spectacle, not endurance. From the moment he was reunited with the Emperor, his purpose had been defined with brutal clarity. Where other primarchs were unleashed like legends, Perturabo was deployed like a tool. He was sent where wars did not end cleanly, where cities did not fall in a single decisive blow, where victory required grinding patience and the willingness to absorb losses without complaint. The Iron Warriors were not celebrated conquerors. They were problem solvers. They arrived after glory had failed and stayed long after hope had been exhausted. World after world broke against their calculations. Fortresses that had humiliated other legions were reduced stone by stone. Trench by trench, life measured against ammunition and found insufficient. Perturabo did not hate this work. He understood it. Siegecraft was truth stripped of illusion. There was no poetry in walls collapsing, no honor in starvation or bombardment. But there was honesty. Every structure failed according to rules. Every defense carried within it the mathematics of its own destruction. Perturabo saw those rules instinctively, the way others saw beauty or faith. What he did not see was gratitude. Compliance records recorded victories in neat data slate entries, stripped of context and cost. Casualty figures were absorbed into administratum tallies. The Iron Warriors moved on before monuments could be raised, before remembrancers arrived to sculpt myths from blood. Other legions sang of brotherhood and destiny. Perturabo's sons counted shells, repaired breaches, and learned to sleep beneath artillery fire because tomorrow would demand the same of them again. The Emperor never corrected this imbalance. Perturabo waited for acknowledgement not because he craved praise, but because recognition would have meant understanding. To be seen was to be validated. To be validated was to know that the suffering had purpose beyond function. But the Emperor spoke to him rarely, and when he did, it was to assign another task, another impossible siege, another war that required certainty rather than inspiration. Silence became instruction. Perturabo began to notice the pattern long before resentment found words. The Iron Warriors were deployed where failure was unacceptable and reward was irrelevant. They were the legions sent to make the Imperium's mistakes survivable. When strategies failed, when compliance actions dragged on for years, when populations resisted with fanatical resolve, Perturabo was summoned, and when the dust settled, others took the credit for an empire, expanded one broken world at a time. He watched his brothers carefully. Rogel Dorn was praised for building fortresses that would never fall, while Perturabo dismantled fortresses that had already consumed entire campaigns. Guilliman was lauded for governance, for shaping worlds into models of imperial efficiency, while Perturabo reduced worlds to rubble, so that governance could begin at all. Even Onron, whose wars left nothing but corpses and ash, was spoken of with a mixture of fear and myth. Perturabo inspired neither. He inspired reliance. Reliance is colder than hatred. It meant he would always be needed and never admired. It meant his legion would bleed so others could shine. It meant that when the Imperium spoke of heroes, his name would be footnote and function rather than legend. Perturabo did not complain. He documented. Every siege was recorded in obsessive detail. Every loss accounted for. Every flaw in Imperial planning noted and filed away in his prodigious memory. He saw inefficiencies no one wished to address, because addressing them would implicate command structures far above his reach. He saw that the Imperium wasted lives not because it was cruel, but because it was careless. Carelessness, to an engineer, is unforgivable. The Iron Warriors began to change under this pressure. They became harder, quieter, less interested in rhetoric or honor. They trusted numbers more than oaths. Where other legions spoke of brotherhood, the Iron Warriors spoke of reliability. They measured worth by endurance, not glory. This was not corruption. It was adaptation to expectation. Perturabo watched as the Imperium's language shifted around him. Faith crept in where reason had once ruled. Compliance became righteousness. Obedience became virtue. Worlds were no longer brought to heal for unity, but for belief. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Perturabo felt like a stress fracture forming beneath a load-bearing pillar. Empires built on belief collapsed differently than those built on reason. He began to wonder whether the Emperor saw this too, or whether he had decided it no longer mattered. That question lodged itself in Perturabo's mind and refused to be dislodged. Not as doubt, as calculation. If the Imperium continued to grow without correcting its structural flaws, then collapse was inevitable. The only unknown variable was scale. Perturabo did not yet think of rebellion, but he had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to measure the Imperium not as a dream, but as a structure under load. And the numbers were not encouraging. Perturabo's greatest flaw, if it could be called that, was that he noticed everything. Where others filter reality through pride or faith, he absorbed it raw. He saw the inefficiencies in fleet deployments, the waste in planetary bombardments ordered for symbolic effect rather than tactical necessity, the way command decisions were shaped by ego long before they were shaped by reason. None of this shocked him at first. Empires were always imperfect. What disturbed him was how little interest there seemed to be in correcting those imperfections once they became inconvenient. The Iron Warriors were expected to compensate. Again and again, Perturabo received orders that arrived already compromised by flawed assumptions. Intelligence underestimated defenders. Supply chains were optimistic to the point of fantasy. Reinforcement schedules assumed ideal conditions in a galaxy that had never offered them. Perturabo adjusted without complaint. He rewrote strategies in real time, rebalanced casualty projections, and absorbed losses that should never have occurred. The sieges succeeded because he refused to let Imperial incompetence become Iron Warrior failure, but success became its own punishment. Each victory reinforced the idea that Perturabo could be relied upon to fix what others broke. Each compliance action taught the High Lords and expeditionary commanders that mistakes had no cost as long as the Lord of Iron was available to pay it. The Iron Warriors did not just fight the Imperium's enemies. They fought its negligence. And negligence, when unchallenged, metastasizes. Perturabo began to sense that his legion's role was no longer temporary. They were no longer the solution to exceptional problems. They were the structural support compensating for a system that refused to reinforce itself. Where Gilliman was allowed to improve worlds after conquest, Perturabo was expected to make conquest possible at any cost. Where Dorn was allowed to build ideals into stone, Perturabo was ordered to tear down realities that contradicted Imperial narrative. The distinction mattered. Construction acknowledged the future. Demolition existed only in the present. Over time, this imbalance carved something sharp into Perturabo's mind. He was not being trained for leadership. He was being conditioned for containment. The Imperium did not want him to shape its destiny. It wanted him to prevent its failures from becoming visible. Siege after siege, he learned that the Iron Warriors were not valued for their vision, but for their willingness to endure what others would not. He noticed how praise was distributed. When a campaign ended in triumph, the names remembered were those who had delivered decisive moments. The speeches celebrated courage, inspiration, unity. Rarely did they mention the years spent breaking fortress lines 1 meter at a time, or the legion that held the line while others regrouped. Perturabo did not resent his brothers for this. He resented the system that required unacknowledged suffering to function. Resentment, however, was still too simple a word. What grew in him was something colder. He began to model the Imperium the way he modeled enemy fortresses. He stripped away rhetoric and focused on load-bearing assumptions. Endless expansion, centralized authority, obedience enforced by belief rather than efficiency. Each assumption carried risk. Each risk was mitigated not through reform, but through brute force applied by legions like his own. The Imperium did not correct errors. It buried them beneath conquered territory. That strategy worked, until it didn't. Perturabo noticed the first signs of saturation long before others did. Campaigns took longer. Resistance grew more desperate. World complied outwardly but rotted beneath the surface. Resources stretched thinner. Casualties rose while strategic gains diminished. The Imperium was growing, but not strengthening. Its mass increased faster than its cohesion. To an engineer, that meant only one thing. Failure was no longer hypothetical. The Iron Warriors felt this shift as keenly as their primarch. Their humor grew darker, their rituals simpler. They stopped caring how they were perceived by other legions because perception had never protected them. They became insular, bound together not by idealism, but by shared understanding. They knew what their duty demanded, and they knew no one would thank them for surviving it. Perturabo did not intervene to soften them. He understood that adaptation was necessary. The Imperium had already decided what kind of legion the Iron Warriors would be. All Perturabo could do was ensure they were honest about it. He trained them to endure pressure without illusion, to accept that loyalty would not be rewarded proportionally, and to find purpose and precision rather than praise. But even as he hardened his legion, something in him resisted full resignation. He still believed the Emperor must see what he saw. That silence was temporary. That at some point, correction would come. Not an apology, not praise, but adjustment, reform, a recognition that the Imperium could not survive on attrition alone. That belief persisted longer than it should have, because the Emperor did not correct the course. And with every unacknowledged victory, with every silent assignment to another unwinnable war, Perturabo's faith in the Imperium's design eroded not through anger, but through arithmetic. He could no longer make a numbers balance without assuming an eventual collapse so catastrophic that all previous sacrifices would become meaningless. That realization did not make him furious. It made him precise. For the first time, Perturabo began to consider that loyalty to a flawed structure might itself be the greatest inefficiency of all. And once that calculation entered his mind, it refused to leave. Perturabo did not share his calculations. That was perhaps the last kindness he offered the Imperium without being asked. He understood how belief functioned among his brothers, how loyalty was sustained not by proof but by momentum. To speak openly of structural failure would not inspire reform. It would inspire panic, denial, or worse, accusations of weakness. The Imperium did not reward those who identified flaws. It rewarded those who concealed them long enough for victory to appear inevitable. So, Perturabo kept his assessments internal, refining them with each campaign. He began to notice how often Imperial victory relied on the assumption that there would always be another legion, another world, another generation to absorb losses. That assumption was never stated aloud, but it shaped every strategic decision. Attrition was acceptable because humanity was vast. Waste was tolerable because expansion continued. The Imperium did not conserve strength. It spent it, confident the supply was infinite. Perturabo knew better. Even a mountain collapses if you remove enough stone. His own legion became proof of that principle. The Iron Warriors endured casualties that would have broken others, but endurance was not immunity. Veterans accumulated scars no apothecary could erase. Dreadnoughts multiplied not because of glory, but because survival often required it. Replacement recruits arrived faster than they could be trained, pressed into service because numbers mattered more than readiness. The Legion functioned, but its efficiency curve bent downward with each successive war. Perturabo tracked that bend obsessively. He did not blame the Iron Warriors. He blamed the system that demanded infinite output from finite material. He blamed the command culture that treated legions as interchangeable tools rather than distinct organisms with limits. He blamed the emperor most of all, not for cruelty, but for omission, for building an empire that assumed compliance would always cost less than reform. This was not rebellion. It was diagnosis. Perturabo began to see himself less as a servant of the Imperium and more as its maintenance engineer, compensating for design flaws that leadership refused to acknowledge. The metaphor haunted him. Maintenance prolongs function, but it does not correct fundamental errors. At best, it delays collapse. At worst, it enables it by masking warning signs until failure becomes catastrophic. He wondered if that was his true role, to keep the Imperium standing long enough to ensure its eventual destruction was total. That thought disturbed him more than any notion of treachery ever could. He watched how other primarchs responded to strain. Some retreated into faith, others into rage, others into myth-making. Perturabo did none of these. He retreated into work, into numbers, into the certainty that calculation still meant something in a galaxy increasingly governed by symbolism and belief. Where others found comfort in narrative, he found clarity in inevitability. The Emperor's silence grew heavier with time. Not absence, but distance. Perturabo could feel that distance whenever he stood in the Emperor's presence, that vast intelligence focused elsewhere, attending to concerns too large or too secret to share. The Emperor did not confide in him, did not ask his opinion, did not seek his assessment of the Imperium's long-term stability. That omission hurt more than criticism ever could. Perturabo had been created to understand systems, to see wholes rather than moments, to predict outcomes others could not. And yet when Imperium began to show signs of stress that threatened its very existence, the one primarch uniquely suited to diagnose those failures was not consulted. He began to ask himself why. The answer, when it came, was unflattering. The Imperium did not want truth. It wanted function. Perturabo provided function without demanding change. He made the impossible possible and the unsustainable survivable. He allowed others to believe in the permanence of structures that should have been redesigned from the ground up. In doing so, he had become indispensable and therefore ignorable. That realization settled into him like cold iron. He did not rage. He did not despair. He adjusted his internal models accordingly. If the Imperium would not change while he supported it, then continued support was no longer neutral. It was complicity in eventual collapse. Every fortress he broke, every world he pacified, every legion he relieved of its own failures pushed the breaking point further into the future while increasing its severity. Perturabo began to understand that the most dangerous loyalty was the kind that prevented necessary failure. This was the point at which his role subtly shifted. Not in action, not in allegiance, but in perspective. He was no longer merely serving the Imperium. He was observing it as one observes a structure one did not design, but is expected to keep standing indefinitely. And he knew, with the certainty that only engineers possess, that there comes a moment when continued repair becomes unethical. Because collapse delayed is not collapse avoided. It is collapse multiplied. That thought did not yet have a name, but it had direction. And once a structure's failure vector is known, it is only a matter of time before someone decides whether to reinforce it or step aside and let gravity finish its work. Perturabo first understood the Emperor's flaw not as a moral failing, but as an architectural one. The revelation did not arrive as betrayal or outrage. It arrived as asymmetry. The Emperor saw humanity in terms of trajectories and epochs, of threats measured across millennia, and solutions scaled to species survival. Perturabo saw humanity in terms of load, stress, and tolerance. Where the Emperor designed for destiny, Perturabo designed for endurance. Both visions were vast. Only one accounted for material fatigue. In the Emperor's presence, Perturabo always felt the same quiet displacement. Not dismissal, not disdain, absence. As if the Emperor's attention passed through him the way a beam passes through glass, illuminating without truly touching. Their conversations, when they occurred, were functional and brief. Assignments, expectations, silence. The Emperor never asked how a war had been won, only whether it was finished. That silence became instructive. Perturabo realized that the Emperor did not value method. He valued outcome. How compliance was achieved mattered less than that it occurred. Casualties were acceptable variables. Devastation was tolerable collateral. The Imperium was not built to minimize suffering. It was built to endure it. From the Emperor's perspective, humanity had survived Old Night only by becoming ruthless enough to impose order on a hostile universe. Mercy was a luxury of stability, not a prerequisite for it. Perturabo understood that logic. What troubled him was its inefficiency. Ruthlessness without optimization is waste. Fear without calibration breeds resistance. The Imperium's expansion relied increasingly on symbolic dominance rather than sustainable integration. Worlds were broken, then left hollow. Compliance was declared while infrastructure lay in ruins. Rebellions flared again not because humanity was inherently defiant, but because governance arrived too late or not at all. Perturabo saw this pattern repeat often enough that it ceased to be coincidence. He tried at first to correct it quietly. During campaigns, he offered adjustments, not challenges to authority, but refinements. Recommendations to preserve industrial capacity, suggestions to delay bombardment until logistical choke points were secured, proposals to garrison worlds properly rather than strip them for the next offensive. These suggestions were acknowledged politely, then ignored. The Crusade's momentum was too valuable to slow. Victory mattered more than sustainability. The Emperor did not intervene. Perturabo began to understand that this was intentional. The Imperium was not designed to be stable yet. It was designed to grow. Stability could come later, once humanity's enemies were broken and the galaxy pacified. The Emperor was building a future that assumed time and resources will remain available long enough to correct early excesses. Perturabo saw the flaw immediately. Growth without reinforcement accumulates stress faster than it accumulates strength. This was not philosophical disagreement. It was mechanical inevitability. The more the Imperium expanded, the more it relied on legions like the Iron Warriors to absorb the resulting failures. The Emperor's design assumed such legions would exist indefinitely, that primarchs would endure without degradation, that loyalty would not fatigue. Perturabo knew that assumption was false. Even demigods degrade under unrelenting load. He wondered if the Emperor knew that and accepted it. That possibility disturbed him more than ignorance ever could. If the Emperor understood the cost and chose to pay it anyway, then the Imperium was not merely flawed. It was exploitative by design. The Iron Warriors were not comrades in a shared vision. They were structural supports intended to fail last. Perturabo measured that realization carefully. He still believed the Emperor's goal, human survival at any cost, might be necessary. But necessity did not absolve inefficiency. If the Imperium devoured its strongest components to sustain momentum, then eventual collapse was not an accident. It was scheduled. The Emperor never explained his long-term plan to Perturabo. Whether out of secrecy, distrust, or simple prioritization, Perturabo could not know. But absence of explanation did not negate consequence. A design that cannot be questioned cannot be corrected, and a structure that cannot be corrected will eventually break in the way it was weakest. Perturabo began to suspect that the Emperor's greatest blind spot was not chaos, nor Xenos, nor rebellion. It was fatigue. Fatigue of material. Fatigue of loyalty. Fatigue of belief forced to carry more weight than it was ever designed to bear. He stood at the edge of that realization, not yet ready to act, but no longer willing to pretend he did not see it. The Imperium was not failing yet, but it was being built in a way that guaranteed it would. And the Emperor, for reasons Perturabo could not accept, refused to look down and check the foundations. Perturabo's doubt did not manifest as defiance. It manifested as restraint. He stopped offering corrections that would never be implemented. He ceased proposing reforms that required the Imperium to slow, to reconsider, to accept that efficiency sometimes demanded patience rather than conquest. Instead, he adjusted inward. If the Emperor's design would not change, then Perturabo would stop pretending his role was to improve it. His task was no longer optimization. It was endurance under conditions that grew less rational with every passing campaign. This shift altered how he perceived the Emperor's authority. Where once he had seen command, he now saw inevitability. Orders arrived not as strategic necessities, but as expressions of momentum. Worlds were marked for compliance because the Crusade needed direction, not because their integration strengthened the Imperium. Resistance was crushed because resistance delayed expansion, not because it threatened humanity's survival. Perturabo understood that the crusade had become self-sustaining, driven by its own mass. Stopping it to reinforce foundations would have required an admission that something had been miscalculated at the beginning. The Emperor did not admit miscalculation. Perturabo began to notice how often the Emperor relied on belief to compensate for structural weakness. Loyalty was framed as virtue, obedience as righteousness, sacrifice as destiny. These concepts were powerful, but they were imprecise. They allowed commanders to substitute zeal for planning and faith for logistics. Where numbers should have guided decisions, slogans did. Where analysis should have prevented catastrophe, myth softened its consequences. This was not accidental. Belief was lighter than steel and faster than supply lines. It could be deployed instantly and did not require maintenance. The Emperor understood this better than anyone. He wielded belief as a tool to accelerate unity, to override hesitation, to keep humanity moving forward despite the cost. Perturabo could not deny its effectiveness. He could only measure its toll. Belief, when used as load-bearing structure, fractures without warning. The Iron Warriors felt that fracture long before it became visible elsewhere. They were ordered to hold lines that should have been abandoned, to assault fortifications whose strategic value did not justify the casualties required. When losses mounted, commanders spoke of destiny and honor rather than reassessing objectives. Perturabo complied, because refusal would have changed nothing and achieved less. But each such order confirmed his assessment. The Imperium was replacing engineering with faith. He began to wonder whether the Emperor intended this transition to be permanent, whether the original vision or rational, unified humanity had already been set aside in favor of something more resilient to dissent. Faith does not ask questions. Faith endures contradiction. Faith allows empires to function long after logic demands revision. If that was a plan, then Perturabo had been designed for an Imperium that no longer existed. This realization hollowed something within him, not loyalty, but relevance. Perturabo was not suited to be a symbol. He could not inspire through rhetoric or myth. His strength lay in understanding how things worked and why they failed. In an empire increasingly governed by belief, that skill set became dangerous. Truth undermines faith. Precision exposes waste. Questions destabilize authority. The Emperor did not silence Perturabo. He simply did not ask him anything that mattered. That exclusion was quieter than censure and far more corrosive. It implied that Perturabo's perspective was no longer useful to the Imperium's direction, that the empire being built had moved beyond the need for honest diagnosis, that survival now depended on momentum and belief rather than correction. Perturabo watched this transformation accelerate. He saw it in the way compliance ceremonies grew more elaborate as governance weakened, in the way symbols multiplied as infrastructure crumbled, in the way casualties were sanctified rather than minimized. The Imperium was not becoming stronger. It was becoming more convincing. To most, this distinction meant nothing. To an engineer, it meant everything. Perturabo did not yet consider separation. He still believed that if the Emperor could be made to see the accumulating stress, if shown the projections without myth or euphemism, adjustments might be possible. But he no longer believed such a conversation would be invited. The Emperor's silence had become policy. The blind design was not ignorance. It was prioritization. The Emperor had chosen a future that required belief to function, even if that belief eventually replaced reason entirely. Perturabo could not reconcile himself to that choice, not because it was immoral, but because it was unstable. A structure built on belief alone does not fail gradually. It fails catastrophically, and it takes everything it supports with it. Perturabo stood within that knowledge, not yet in opposition, but no longer aligned. He continued to execute orders with the precision expected of him, even as his internal models diverged further from Imperial doctrine. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, the distance between him and the Emperor became measurable. And once a gap can be measured, it can be crossed or widened. The moment Perturabo understood that the Emperor would never ask for his counsel was the moment his loyalty changed shape. It did not fracture. It did not snap. It redistributed its weight. He still obeyed. He still prosecuted wars with the same ruthless efficiency. The Iron Warriors continued to arrive where resistance was strongest and hope was weakest. From the outside, nothing distinguished him from the primarch he had always been. But inwardly, obedience ceased to be devotion and became procedure. Orders were no longer expressions of shared purpose. They were inputs. Outputs followed. This distinction mattered more than rebellion ever could. Perturabo began to treat Imperial commands the way he treated flawed blueprints. He executed them precisely while compensating for their deficiencies wherever possible, not out of faith, but out of professional integrity. He could not allow incompetence to waste his legion's lives any more than necessary. But each compensation widened the gap between Imperial intent and operational reality, and Perturabo knew what that meant. He was becoming the Imperium's invisible stabilizer. The Emperor's design increasingly relied on primarchs, not merely as generals, but as symbols. Horus inspired. Sanguinius embodied hope. Guilliman organized belief into civic structure. Even Dorn's fortresses served as monuments to permanence. Perturabo alone was expected to function without narrative. His victories were necessary, but inconvenient. They did not fit the story the Imperium was telling itself. And stories, once entrenched, resist correction more fiercely than any fortress. Perturabo watched as the Crusades' language shifted further from reason. Failures were reframed as tests of faith. Losses were sanctified rather than interrogated. Commanders who questioned assumptions were sidelined, while those who spoke in absolutes rose faster. The Imperium was not collapsing. It was hardening into something brittle. He began to see the Emperor less as an architect and more as a force vector. The Emperor pushed humanity forward with unimaginable power, but did not remain behind to reinforce what had been built. His gaze was always ahead, fixed on threats yet unseen, catastrophes yet unrealized. Perturabo could respect that urgency. He could not respect the assumption that what lay behind would somehow hold. The Emperor trusted belief to bear the load. Perturabo trusted materials. This difference was no longer reconcilable. He began to consider what would happen if he stopped compensating. The thought was brief and immediately dismissed. To withdraw support prematurely would not teach the Imperium a lesson. It would only accelerate collapse and kill billions who had no say in the design. Perturabo would not become that kind of executioner. If failure came, it would come because the structure was unsound, not because he had sabotaged it. Still, the question lingered. At what point does continued support become sabotage of the future? Perturabo understood that systems sometimes require stress testing to reveal their true limits. But the Imperium could not be stress tested without catastrophic loss. Its scale made controlled failure impossible. Any lesson learned would be written in blood too vast to justify the experiment. This was the Emperor's final blind spot. By making the Imperium too large to fail safely, he had ensured that failure, when it came, would be total. Perturabo began to look beyond the crusade itself. He studied compliance worlds years after conquest, reviewing reports others ignored. He noted how often rebellion resurfaced in places where governance had been symbolic rather than functional. He tracked supply inefficiencies across sectors and saw patterns repeating despite changes in command. The same errors propagated faster than they could be corrected because the Imperium had no mechanism for feedback that contradicted its narrative. Feedback loops had been replaced by dogma. The Iron Warriors felt this more keenly with each passing decade. They were deployed not just to win wars, but to suppress the consequences of previous victories. Each siege they fought was the echo of an earlier oversight. Each attritional campaign patched a flaw that had never been addressed at its source. Perturabo understood then that the Imperium did not want him to prevent failure. It wanted him to delay it. That realization marked the true beginning of a separation, not from the Emperor, but from the idea that obedience and survival were the same thing. He could still respect the Emperor's intellect, his vision, even his necessity, but he no longer believed that vision could produce a stable outcome. The Emperor was building for destiny. Perturabo was building for reality, and reality was beginning to diverge too sharply to ignore. He did not yet know what form that divergence would take. He did not imagine banners turned or oaths broken. He only knew that if the Imperium continued on its present course, then at some point, someone would have to choose between preserving the structure and preserving the species. The Emperor had already chosen. Perturabo was no longer certain he agreed. The first time Perturabo realized that faith had begun replacing reason within the legions, it was not during a council war or a proclamation from Terra. It was on a battlefield that should never have existed. The world had already complied. Its defenses were broken, its leadership executed, its manufactoria intact enough to justify preservation. By every rational metric, the war was over, yet resistance flared again weeks later, fueled not by logistics or strategy, but by belief. Not belief in freedom or sovereignty, but belief that suffering itself was proof of righteousness. Civilians threw themselves against iron warrior lines with improvised weapons, chanting slogans that promised meaning in death rather than survival and surrender. Perturabo watched the first assault in silence. This was not tactics. This was liturgy. The Imperium responded as it increasingly did, with escalation rather than analysis. Orbital strikes were authorized where containment would have sufficed. Entire districts were leveled to make examples. Commanders spoke of cleansing corruption, of stamping out heresy before it could spread. No one asked why belief had taken root so quickly or why compliance had failed to integrate anything beyond obedience. Faith had become a substitute for governance. Perturabo understood immediately that this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern. The Imperium was no longer content to conquer worlds. It demanded affirmation. Submission was no longer enough. Compliance had to be internal, ideological, unquestioned. Where reason failed to unify, belief was imposed. The Iron Warriors were ordered to suppress the rebellion entirely. They did so with precision, because precision was all they had left. Trenches were cut, firing lines established. Resistance collapsed under artillery fire that did not discriminate between believer and bystander. The Legion did its work efficiently and without ceremony. But as the guns fell silent, Perturabo felt something settle into place with grim finality. This was the future. War is not fought to secure territory or resources, but to enforce narrative. Sieges not against fortresses, but against thought itself. The Iron Warriors, once tools of rational conquest, were becoming instruments of ideological containment. They were not breaking walls anymore. They were breaking meaning. Perturabo saw how belief simplified command. Faith removed a need for explanation. Orders did not require justification if framed as destiny. Losses could be sanctified rather than corrected. Questions could be labeled disloyalty. The Imperium's growing reliance on belief was not accidental. It was efficient in the short term. It accelerated obedience. It reduced dissent. It allowed expansion to continue without addressing systemic weakness. But belief also removed limits. A fortress can only absorb so much bombardment before it collapses. Faith has no such threshold. It demands more sacrifice precisely because sacrifice reinforces it. The more lives were spent in its name, the harder it became to admit that those lives had been wasted. Faith turned error into obligation. Perturabo recognized this mechanism instantly. It was an iron cage, and once constructed, it did not require guards. Those trapped within it enforced it themselves. He saw how the Iron Warriors were being positioned within this cage. Their lack of myth made them ideal enforcers. They were not symbols to be worshipped. They were instruments to be deployed. When belief-driven resistance arose, the Iron Warriors were sent to erase it without asking why it had formed. They cleaned the consequences of a system that increasingly refused to examine itself. This work hardened them further. The Legion's officers stopped speaking of Imperial ideals altogether. They spoke only of objectives and thresholds. Casualty projections became colder, more exact. Mercy was not debated because debate implied uncertainty, and uncertainty was now considered weakness. The Iron Warriors adapted because adaptation was survival. Perturabo felt the weight of that adaptation personally. He had once believed that truth, if presented clearly enough, could correct course, that the Emperor's silence was temporary, not absolute. But belief does not negotiate with truth. It absorbs contradiction and recasts it as proof of necessity. The The more obvious the Imperium's flaws became, the more aggressively faith was deployed to justify them. This was not ignorance. It was defense. Perturabo realized then that the Imperium was no longer simply flawed. It was protected from correction by the very beliefs sustaining it. Any attempt to reform it from within would be interpreted as heresy, not improvement. The iron cage had closed, and the key had been thrown away in the name of unity. He did not yet see a path forward, but he understood with grim certainty that the Imperium had crossed a threshold. It had chosen faith over reason not as a temporary expedient, but as a governing principle. And once faith becomes load-bearing, removing it causes collapse. Perturabo stood at the center of that realization, watching his legion execute orders that grew less rational by the year, knowing that every siege fought in the name of belief reinforced the very structure he now understood to be unstable. The iron cage was no longer metaphor. It was policy, and Perturabo, architect by nature and necessity, could see exactly how such a structure would eventually fail. The only unanswered question was whether he would still be inside it when it did. Once belief became doctrine, resistance changed its shape. No longer did rebellion announce itself with banners or clear chains of command. It surfaced as persistence. Cells that reformed no matter how thoroughly they were broken. Populations that complied publicly while nurturing defiance privately, not because they believed they could win, but because belief had taught them that suffering itself was victory. The Imperium responded as it always did when faced with ambiguity, with excess force framed as moral necessity. Perturabo saw the inefficiency immediately. You cannot starve faith. You cannot bombard it into submission. Every martyr created by indiscriminate suppression reinforced the narrative that resistance was righteous. The Iron Warriors crushed these movements because they were ordered to, but Perturabo tracked the aftermath obsessively. Casualty ratios worsened. Pacification periods lengthened. The cost of maintaining compliance rose faster than territorial gain. Faith did not simplify war. It prolonged it. The Emperor did not adjust strategy. Instead, belief was intensified. Ecclesiastic figures, unofficial but increasingly influential, followed in the wake of the legions. Symbols multiplied. Rituals replaced administration. Compliance was no longer declared by the rebuilding of infrastructure or restoration of trade, but by the public performance of loyalty. Worlds learned quickly that appearing faithful mattered more than functioning effectively. Perturabo watched the Imperium trade durability for conformity. The Iron Warriors were increasingly deployed not as conquerors, but as enforcers of this transformation. They were ordered to make examples, to erase populations whose defiance threatened the illusion of universal belief. Precision gave way to spectacle. Fortresses were not merely reduced. They were obliterated beyond tactical necessity to send a message. Perturabo complied outwardly while cataloging the damage such methods inflicted on long-term stability. The Legion paid the price. Morale eroded in ways no amount of discipline could fully arrest. Veterans no longer believed they were building something that would endure. They believed only that they were preventing immediate collapse. That belief, or lack of it, changed how men fought. Endurance remained, but conviction hollowed out. The Iron Warriors became masters of holding ground that should never have been contested in the first place. Perturabo felt responsible, not for the Imperium's choices, but for enabling them. Every time his legion succeeded under impossible conditions, it validated the strategy that had created those conditions. The Emperor's blind design relied on men like Perturabo to absorb the consequences of its reliance on faith. As long as the Iron Warriors endured, reform could be postponed indefinitely. He began to see the Iron Cage not merely as a system trapping others, but as one closing around himself. Faith had made dissent unthinkable. Critique was equated with disloyalty. Efficiency was suspect if it contradicted narrative. The Imperium no longer needed to silence voices like Perturabo's because it had created an environment where such voices would never be invited to speak. The structure enforced itself. This realization forced a painful recalibration. Perturabo had always believed that loyalty required honesty, that serving a system meant improving it where possible. But the Imperium had crossed into a phase where improvement was indistinguishable from betrayal. The Iron Cage did not permit modification. It permitted only expansion or collapse. He began to consider alternatives he had previously dismissed as unthinkable. Not rebellion, not yet, but disengagement, withdrawal of assumption, the possibility that his role as stabilizer was no longer morally neutral, that by preventing failure, he was ensuring something worse. The Imperium's faith-driven momentum was accelerating toward a collapse that would consume far more lives than any single rebellion ever could. Perturabo did not want that outcome, but he could not see a way to prevent it from within. The Iron Warriors noticed a change in their primarch, though he said nothing. Orders remained precise, but something in his demeanor hardened further, becoming less patient with rhetoric, less tolerant of waste justified by belief. He pushed his legion toward even stricter discipline, not to serve the Imperium better, but to preserve them against what was coming. Because if collapse was inevitable, endurance alone would not be enough. They would need clarity. Faith promised meaning. Perturabo promised truth, however bleak. The Iron Warriors began to understand that their loyalty was no longer to the Imperium's ideals, but to one another and to the integrity of their work. They would fight because they were ordered to, but they would remember why those orders existed and what they cost. The Iron Cage of Faith had achieved its purpose. It unified the Imperium against doubt, but in doing so, it had created a population of enforcers who no longer believed in the structure they upheld. Perturabo stood among them, aware that once belief fails, only force remains, and force, applied without conviction, eventually turns inward. The cage was complete, and something within it was beginning to test its bars. The breaking point did not arrive with a scream. It arrived with routine. Perturabo stood before a hololithic projection of a world already marked for annihilation, its name reduced to alphanumeric designation, its population statistics summarized in neat columns that made suffering appear manageable. The justification was familiar: persistent ideological noncompliance. Resistance cells regenerated faster than suppression. Faith had failed to take root in the correct configuration. The solution was escalation, framed as mercy through finality. He had approved such orders before. What made this one different was not scale or brutality. It was redundancy. The same conditions had existed on a dozen other worlds. The same response had been applied. The same outcome had followed. Temporary silence, long-term instability, eventual renewed resistance somewhere else. The Imperium was not learning. It was repeating itself with increasing confidence. Faith had become automation. Perturabo realized then that the Iron Cage no longer required belief at all. It functioned independently of conviction, driven by procedural momentum and institutional inertia. Commanders did not believe escalation worked because they had evidence. They believed it worked because it was what the Imperium did. Habit had replaced strategy. Ritual had replaced assessment. This was more dangerous than fanaticism. Fanatics can be reasoned with once their beliefs fracture. Systems built on habit continue long after belief collapses entirely. The Imperium had reached that stage. Faith had built the cage. Routine now maintained it. Perturabo issued the orders, not because he agreed with them, but because refusal would have changed nothing. The Iron Warriors would have been replaced by another legion less precise, more theatrical, more wasteful. He told himself that compliance under his command minimized harm, that his legion's discipline reduced excess suffering, that he was still doing the least damage possible within an unforgiving system. The calculation rang hollow, because minimizing harm within a machine designed to produce it does not absolve participation. It only delays consequence. Perturabo had spent decades delaying consequence, and the machine had grown larger, heavier, more destructive as a result. He watched the bombardment through data feeds rather than vision. Numbers updated. Objectives ticked off. Resistance metrics declined to 0. Somewhere below, billions died for failing to believe correctly. The Imperium recorded it as a success. Perturabo recorded it as confirmation. The Iron Cage was complete not because belief was enforced, but because alternatives had been erased. The Imperium no longer knew how to respond to failure, except by amplifying the behavior that caused it. Faith had not strengthened the structure. It had removed its ability to adapt. He thought of the Emperor then, not in anger, but in weary understanding. The Emperor had chosen this path deliberately. Belief was faster than reform. Control was safer than dialogue. Humanity could be unified through fear of the unknown long enough to face greater threats. Perhaps that calculus was correct on a galactic scale, but it was unsustainable. Perturabo saw now that the Emperor's blind design had produced an empire incapable of self-correction. The iron cage of faith was not a temporary scaffold. It was permanent load-bearing structure. Remove it, and everything collapsed. Leave it, and collapse became inevitable anyway, only larger. There was no good outcome. This was the truth Perturabo could no longer ignore. He did not announce his realization. He did not share it with his legion. He internalized it the way he internalized all things that mattered. The Imperium was no longer a system he could repair from within. It was a structure he could only choose to support or abandon. And abandonment, when it came, would not be dramatic. It would be precise. Perturabo began preparing. Without naming what he prepared for, he studied supply lines more closely. He tracked which worlds relied most heavily on Iron Warrior intervention. He noted where his legion's presence was considered indispensable. These were not acts of treachery. They were contingency planning. An engineer's habit. One always prepares for failure, even if one hopes it never comes. The Iron Warriors sensed a shift again. Their campaigns grew more controlled, less reactive. Perturabo began refusing gratuitous spectacle where refusal was possible, framing objections in logistical terms rather than ideological ones. He could not stop the Imperium's momentum, but he could reduce unnecessary acceleration. He hardened his legion not just against enemy fire, but against disillusionment. He taught them to trust numbers over slogans, each other over ceremony. Faith had become a weapon. Perturabo chose clarity instead. The iron cage held, but for the first time, Perturabo could see exactly where it would fail and how catastrophic that failure would be. The knowledge did not make him hopeful. It made him patient, because structures do not collapse when they are challenged. They collapse when the forces holding them together quietly decide to stop compensating. And somewhere deep within the machinery of the Imperium, the Lord of Iron began to consider the unthinkable not as betrayal, but as responsibility. Perturabo did not think of what followed as betrayal. He thought of it as recalibration. Engineers do not ask whether a structure deserves to stand. They ask whether it can. When the answer becomes no, sentiment becomes irrelevant. What matters is containment, how much damage the collapse will cause, and whether it can be directed rather than allowed to annihilate everything around it. Perturabo had reached that point with the Imperium, not emotionally, logically. The realization was isolating. No other primarch would have reached it this way. Some would fall to pride, others to rage, others to seduction or despair. Perturabo felt none of these. He felt the cold clarity that arrives when variables align too cleanly to ignore. The Imperium was structurally unsound, and continued loyalty only increased the eventual casualty count. The question was no longer whether collapse would occur, but whether it would be guided or catastrophic. This was the calculus no one else would perform. Perturabo reviewed the Imperium's architecture as he would any fortress. Centralized authority without feedback loops. Ideological load-bearing elements replacing material ones. Expansion without reinforcement. A command structure that rewarded belief over correction. Each flaw alone was survivable. Together, they formed a failure cascade waiting for a trigger. He understood then that chaos was not the cause of the Imperium's future destruction. It was a stress fracture that would reveal it. Perturabo did not yet trust the ruinous powers. He distrusted them instinctively. They were not solutions. They were forces volatile, predatory, unreliable. But they were also honest in a way the Imperium was not. They did not pretend stability where none existed. They did not sanctify waste. They did not promise endurance. They promised power at a price, and the price was never hidden. That transparency mattered. The Emperor demanded obedience without explanation. Chaos demanded surrender with full disclosure. To an engineer, both were unacceptable. But one at least acknowledged reality as it was rather than as it wished to be. Perturabo did not turn toward chaos out of devotion. He turned toward it because it represented an external pressure capable of testing the Imperium's limits. A stress test. The thought was dangerous, and Perturabo treated it as such. He did not act impulsively. He observed. He measured. He watched how other primarchs responded to strain, noting patterns. Some cracked under emotional load. Some were drawn toward excess. Others retreated into absolutism. Perturabo remained apart, unwilling to mistake reaction for decision. He began to conceptualize separation not as rebellion, but as load redistribution. If the Imperium could no longer support all its structures, then some would inevitably fail. Better that those failures occur in controlled segments rather than as total collapse. Better that stress be diverted outward than allowed to accumulate unchecked. The Imperium's enemies would exploit any fracture. That was inevitable. The only choice was whether the fracture occurred on Imperium's terms or the enemy's. This was the grim irony. By turning against the Imperium, Perturabo could reduce the damage it would eventually suffer. That logic horrified him. It also made sense. He did not imagine himself as savior or villain. Those were narrative roles, and he had learned to distrust narrative. He saw himself as a necessary discontinuity, a break in the system that might force recognition of its limits. If the Imperium could not adapt to that shock, then it deserved to fall. If it could, then perhaps something smaller, more stable, might endure. The Emperor had denied the Imperium the chance to fail safely. Perturabo would not. He began to detach emotionally from outcomes. Victories mattered less than positioning. He ensured the Iron Warriors retained operational independence wherever possible. Supply lines were diversified, command structures internalized. He did not announce these changes. He justified them as efficiency improvements. No one questioned him. The Imperium had learned to trust his competence even when it ignored his conclusions. That trust would prove fatal. Perturabo did not yet choose a side. He chose preparation. He knew that when the moment came, it would not be announced by revelation or rage. It would be marked by a simple decision: to stop compensating, to let the Imperium experience the stress it had deferred for too long, to allow failure to occur at a scale that might be survivable rather than absolute. This was not treachery born of hatred. It was treachery born of responsibility. And once that calculation was made, it could not be unmade. The only remaining uncertainty was timing. And Perturabo, patient beyond reason, waited. Timing, Perturabo knew, was the difference between rupture and collapse. A structure can absorb a controlled fracture if the stress is redirected deliberately. It cannot survive simultaneous failure across all load-bearing points. The Imperium, vast and rigid, had reached a state where every major system depended on the assumption that someone else would compensate. Someone always had. Perturabo had. The Iron Warriors had. That pattern had trained the Imperium to mistake endurance for stability. Perturabo began identifying where withdrawal would be felt first and least catastrophically. He examined campaigns where Iron Warrior presence was considered essential rather than symbolic. Border wars that dragged on because other legions rotated out once glory diminished. Siege zones maintained only because Iron Warrior logistics kept them functional. Worlds whose compliance existed solely because his legion absorbed the worst of resistance. These were not weaknesses the Imperium acknowledged. They were dependencies it had forgotten it possessed. To remove support abruptly would be annihilation. To remove it precisely would be revelation. Perturabo understood that treachery, to be meaningful, could not be theatrical. It had to look like miscalculation, like overextension, like the natural consequence of Imperial assumptions colliding with reality. If the Imperium learned anything from failure, it would not be from denunciation or revolt. It would be from silence where reliability had once existed. He did not yet withdraw. He tested. Orders were executed exactly as written, without compensatory adjustment. Siege plans were followed to the letter rather than refined in the field. Supply assumptions were allowed to fail when they were unsupported by reality. The Iron Warriors did not sabotage. They complied honestly. The results were immediate. Casualties rose. Campaigns stalled. Other legions requested reinforcement earlier and more often. Commanders accustomed to Iron Warrior correction began to notice gaps they could not explain. Reports spoke of inexplicable resistance, of operations that should have succeeded but did not. No one traced these failures to Perturabo, because nothing he had done violated protocol. He had simply stopped fixing mistakes that were never meant to be survivable. Perturabo felt no satisfaction watching this unfold, only confirmation. The Imperium reacted predictably. Faith intensified. Commanders invoked destiny where logistics failed. More aggressive measures were authorized to compensate for inefficiency. The iron cage tightened. Each failure produced not reflection, but escalation. The machine did not question itself. It demanded more. Perturabo saw then that his initial premise had been correct. The Imperium could not learn through incremental failure. It could only learn through fracture. This realization forced him closer to the edge he had been circling. If limited withdrawal merely hardened Imperial response, then controlled opposition might be the only remaining lever. A force large enough to impose consequence without annihilation. A counterweight capable of absorbing stress that would otherwise shatter everything at once. Chaos remained the only such force available. Perturabo despised the idea. The ruinous powers were not allies. They were corrosive phenomena, embodiments of excess and entropy that could never produce stability on their own. But they did not lie about what they were. They did not promise order. They promised power in exchange for degradation. The Imperium promised order while accelerating decay. Between the two, Perturabo trusted the honest hazard more than the disguised one. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He did not surrender. He observed. He listened where others recoiled. He learned the contours of the warp not as a supplicant, but as one studies fire. Dangerous, uncontrollable, yet governed by laws. Chaos was not reason, but it was consistent in its inconsistency. It could be accounted for. Faith could not. Perturabo began preparing his legion for independence not through rhetoric, but through structure. Command autonomy was increased. Siege doctrines revised to function without external reinforcement. Logistics hardened against disruption. The Iron Warriors did not know why these changes were occurring, only that they made survival more likely under unpredictable conditions. They trusted Perturabo because he had never lied to them. That trust weighed heavier than any oath. The final calculation was not about victory. It was about scale. If the Imperium fell entirely, humanity would burn. If chaos consumed everything, nothing stable would remain. But the Imperium fractured. If its false unity shattered into smaller, competing structures, then some might survive. Not because they were righteous, but because they were manageable. Perturabo did not claim moral superiority in this conclusion. He accepted moral guilt. He understood that whatever came next would stain him beyond redemption. That history would remember him not as a corrector, but as a traitor. That nuance would be lost, motive simplified into betrayal, because complexity does not survive war. He accepted that too. Engineers do not require gratitude. They require function. When Perturabo finally allowed himself to imagine a future without Imperial obedience, it was not one of triumph or dominion. It was one of necessary violence constrained by calculation rather than sanctified by faith. A future where collapse occurred in segments rather than as total annihilation. The Emperor had chosen unity at all costs. Perturabo chose cost containment. And in that choice, the line between loyalty and treachery ceased to matter. What mattered was whether anything would remain standing when the structure finally failed. The moment Perturabo accepted that separation was inevitable, the question of loyalty stopped troubling him. Loyalty, he understood now, was not a virtue in itself. It was a structural property. It existed to maintain cohesion under stress. When cohesion became destructive, when it demanded sacrifice without correction, loyalty transformed from stabilizer into accelerant. The Imperium had reached that state. Continued unity no longer preserved humanity. It amplified the scale of its eventual ruin. Perturabo did not announce his conclusion, not even to himself in words. He expressed it through omission. He stopped intervening in the political rivalries of other legions. He withdrew from councils where decisions had already been made in language that no longer allowed revision. He reduced his presence in theaters where his voice would only be used to justify outcomes he did not choose. None of this registered as rebellion. It registered as professionalism. The Lord of Iron had always been reserved. No one questioned his silence now. Silence, when consistent, becomes invisible. The Iron Warriors continued to prosecute wars, but their posture shifted subtly. They avoided unnecessary overextension. They refused symbolic gestures that did not serve operational goals. They fortified their own supply chains rather than relying on Imperial assurances. These choices were framed as efficiency. They were accepted because efficiency was the Iron Warrior's reputation. Perturabo was building conditions for departure without declaring it. He did not yet align with chaos, but neither did he pretend it was irrelevant. He began to treat the warp as an environmental factor rather than a moral one. Just as radiation or vacuum imposes constraints, so too did the Imperium. He studied its effects on logistics, morale, and command coherence. He noted where Imperial doctrine relied on denial rather than mitigation. Chaos was not an answer, but it was a force the Imperium could not control. That alone made it useful. Perturabo did not believe chaos could be mastered. He believed it could be shaped temporarily, the way an explosion can be directed by proper placement of charges. Dangerous, impermanent, but effective in breaking structures that cannot be dismantled by hand. The Emperor had built an empire too vast to reform peacefully. Perturabo would introduce a failure that forced reconfiguration. This was the last step of his calculation. Not alliance, instrumentalization. He understood the cost immediately. Chaos does not lend power without claiming residue. Exposure would alter his legion, perhaps irrevocably. Discipline would be tested by temptation, endurance by excess. Perturabo accepted this risk because all alternatives were worse. Better to face a known corruption than continue, enabling a hidden one that consumed entire civilizations. He prepared for that corruption as best he could. Iron Warrior's doctrine was revised to emphasize control over zeal, discipline over ecstasy. Emotional expression was minimized not out of cruelty, but as insulation. Siegecraft remained methodical. Ritual was avoided where possible. If the warp would intrude, it would be treated as hostile terrain, not divine influence. Perturabo did not plan to worship anything. He planned to survive it long enough to use it. The irony was not lost on him. The Emperor had shaped Perturabo to understand failure, to see the moment when a structure must be allowed to break. Now that same design made him uniquely capable of committing treachery without illusion. He would not revel in it. He would not romanticize it. He would execute it as grim necessity. When the final decision came, it was not marked by revelation or emotion. It came during a routine review of casualty projections. Perturabo compared two futures. In one, the Iron Warriors continued to support Imperial expansion, delaying collapse until Imperium spanned the galaxy and failed under its own mass. In the other, fracture occurred sooner, violently, but at a scale that might leave fragments capable of endurance. Both futures were terrible. One was survivable. Perturabo chose survivable. He understood then that the Emperor's greatest mistake had not been reliance on faith, nor secrecy, nor brutality. It had been assuming that those who saw the flaws would continue compensating forever. The Emperor had mistaken endurance for consent. Perturabo withdrew that consent quietly. The moment would come when banners would turn and oaths would be broken. History would mark that as a day of betrayal. Perturabo knew better. The betrayal had occurred long before, when correction was no longer permitted, when truth was treated as threat, when belief became load-bearing and reason was dismissed as weakness. What Perturabo prepared to do was not treachery against the Emperor. It was honesty against an empire that could no longer afford it. And once that honesty took form in action, there would be no path back. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because the structure itself would never survive the admission that he had been right. The day Perturabo turned against the Emperor did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a release of tension that had been accumulating for decades, a structural groan finally giving way beneath load that had long exceeded tolerance. There were no speeches delivered to assembled legionaries, no banners torn down in fury, no ritual declaration of defiance. The Iron Warriors did not roar their betrayal into the void. They simply ceased to correct Imperial failure. That was enough. The first signs appeared as absence rather than action. Requests for Iron Warrior reinforcement went unanswered longer than expected. Siege zones that relied on their logistical discipline began to fray at the edges. Commanders accustomed to the Lord of Iron's quiet interventions discovered that plans approved on Terra failed exactly as written. Supply convoys arrived late or insufficient because assumptions had not been questioned. Casualties mounted not through sabotage, but through honesty. Perturabo did not countermand Imperial orders. He executed them precisely. This distinction mattered. It allowed the Imperium to experience the consequences of its own design without the illusion of external treachery to blame. Systems failed because they were unsound, not because someone had attacked them. Fortresses held longer than expected in some sectors and collapsed prematurely in others, not due to chaos, but because the Iron Warriors were no longer compensating for errors that had been normalized as acceptable. The Imperium responded with escalation. It always did. Faith surged to fill the gaps left by failing logistics. Commanders invoked destiny when supply lines broke. Losses were sanctified as proof of righteousness rather than signals of inefficiency. Where Iron Warrior discipline had once minimized excess, replacement forces applied brutality with theatrical abandon. The machine did not slow. It accelerated. Perturabo watched this with grim detachment. This was the confirmation he had waited for. Not that the Imperium could fail, but that it would not adapt when it did. The iron cage did not loosen under strain. It tightened, converting error into dogma, and dogma into justification for further error. The structure rejected correction entirely. The Iron Warriors felt the shift immediately. They were still obeying orders, but those orders no longer aligned with survival. Campaigns that once would have been stabilized through calculated restraint now spiraled into attrition. Legionaries died not because the enemy was stronger, but because Imperial planning had assumed Iron Warrior intervention that no longer arrived. The Legion understood what this meant long before it was spoken aloud. Their primarch had stopped compensating. This was not abandonment. It was truth. Perturabo did not frame it as liberation. He did not tell his sons they were free from obligation. He told them nothing at all. He simply allowed them to see the Imperium as it was, without his corrections masking its flaws. The Iron Warriors, disciplined to the core, adapted as they always had, by hardening, by trusting one another, by accepting that survival would now depend on internal coherence rather than external command. Some asked questions. Perturabo answered them honestly. He did not speak of chaos. He did not speak of rebellion. He spoke of limits, of systems stretched beyond tolerance, of an Imperium that had chosen belief over correction and could no longer distinguish sacrifice from waste. He did not ask his legion to hate the Emperor. He asked them to acknowledge reality. They did. The day Iron stopped obeying was not marked by defiance, but by refusal to lie. The Iron Warriors would no longer pretend that the Imperium's demands were survivable simply because they had endured them before. They would no longer absorb infinite failure to preserve an illusion of unity. They would fight where fighting made sense. They would withdraw where withdrawal preserved strength. They would no longer be the hidden supports holding up a structure that refused to repair itself. This decision did not make them heroes. It made them targets. Imperial Command noticed the change slowly. Then all at once, reports accumulated. Patterns emerged. The absence of Iron Warrior stabilization created cascading failures across multiple fronts. Worlds that should have fallen quickly did not. Others fell too fast, leaving infrastructure unusable. The Great Crusade's momentum faltered, not catastrophically, but visibly. Someone had to be blamed. Perturabo understood this inevitability. The Imperium could not accept that its design was flawed. It required a traitor to preserve a narrative of infallibility. When that accusation came, it would come with all the fury of faith betrayed. There would be no trial, no debate, no accounting of cause and effect. Only judgment. Perturabo did not flinch from that future. He had already accepted the cost. The Emperor would see this as treachery. History would remember it as betrayal. But Perturabo knew the truth was simpler and more damning. The Imperium had not been attacked. It had been allowed to experience itself. And once that experience began, there was no way to contain it. The Iron Warriors stood at the edge of a war that would redefine the galaxy, not as champions or villains, but as a first to stop lying about what endurance actually cost. This was the day Iron stopped obeying, not because it hated its maker, but because it could no longer pretend the structure deserved to stand. The accusation arrived exactly as Perturabo had predicted, not as inquiry, not as dialogue, but as assumption hardened into decree. Vox traffic shifted tone first, messages acquiring a strained formality that attempted neutrality while already condemning him. Requests for clarification were framed as loyalty tests. Orders arrived that contradicted one another, designed less to achieve victory than to force a response that could be interpreted as defiance. The Imperium was not seeking truth. It was seeking confirmation. Perturabo provided none. He did not denounce the Emperor. He did not proclaim independence. He continued to execute orders where they aligned with survival and refuse them where they did not, documenting each decision with meticulous clarity. The Iron Warriors fought as they always had, disciplined, methodical, unadorned by rhetoric. What changed was context. Each action now existed beneath scrutiny, interpreted not as judgment but as motive. The Imperium could not tolerate that ambiguity. Faith requires clean lines, heroes and traitors, obedience and rebellion. A primarch who neither raged nor begged, who neither fled nor proclaimed allegiance elsewhere, destabilized the narrative more thoroughly than open revolt ever could. Perturabo's refusal to perform betrayal made him intolerable. The order was issued quietly, not extermination, not yet. Censure, isolation. Other legions were instructed to limit cooperation. Supply channels were rerouted. Reinforcement requests were denied under pretext of strategic necessity. The Iron Warriors were not attacked. They were starved of Imperial reliance. This, too, was predictable. Perturabo had long understood that the Imperium punished deviation not through immediate destruction, but through abandonment framed as righteousness. To be cut off was to be declared impure. Without saying so aloud, the Iron Warriors felt the effect immediately. They were forced to rely entirely on their own logistics, their own discipline, their own coherence. They endured. They always had. But endurance alone no longer defined their future. The first true break came when an Imperial commander refused Iron Warrior withdrawal from a siege that had become tactically meaningless. Casualties mounted for no strategic gain. The world's infrastructure reduced to rubble in service of ideological compliance rather than survival. Perturabo issued a withdrawal order anyway, citing objective failure and unacceptable loss curves. The Iron Warriors disengaged cleanly, leaving behind a war that could no longer justify itself. That moment was seized upon. The declaration followed swiftly, stripped of nuance and saturated with certainty. Perturabo was named traitor not because he had allied with chaos, but because he had refused annihilation framed as duty. The distinction was erased immediately. Faith does not tolerate gradients. Once declared, the label rewrote every preceding action. The Iron Warriors were ordered to be brought to heel. It was then, and only then, that Perturabo acted openly. He did not strike Terra. He did not issue a manifesto. He fortified. He consolidated. He repositioned his legion along supply lines and fortress worlds that had always depended on Iron Warrior reliability. He did not seize them violently. He assumed control through necessity. The Imperium had forgotten how many systems functioned only because Iron had held them together. Now Iron withdrew its consent. Other legions arrived expecting defiance and found preparation. Expecting chaos, they found discipline. Perturabo did not seek decisive confrontation. He sought pressure redistribution. Each engagement forced Imperial commanders to confront logistics without Iron Warrior correction. Each delay magnified systemic weakness. The war did not erupt in a single cataclysmic moment. It unfolded as cascading failure. Chaos noticed, not as master, not as savior, but as gravity notices collapse. The warp pressed closer, offering power in exchange for abandonment of restraint. Perturabo refused that bargain in its pure form. He accepted only what could be contained, weaponized, directed. The Iron Warriors did not kneel. They did not chant. They treated the warp as hazardous material, useful under controlled conditions, lethal when indulged. This choice would damn them in ways no enemy ever could, but it preserved their coherence. The Emperor did not speak. That silence, more than any condemnation, finalized Perturabo's path. The Emperor's absence confirmed everything Perturabo had calculated. There would be no correction, no acknowledgement of fault, no attempt to adapt. The Imperium would rather burn than admit that its structure was flawed. So Perturabo let it burn selectively. The Iron Warriors did not fight for dominion. They fought to constrain collapse, to fracture the Imperium into segments that might survive rather than a monolith destined to shatter completely. They became what history would call villains, because history favors intention over consequence. Perturabo accepted that too. The last time he stood before a projection of the Imperium as a unified whole, he felt no triumph and no sorrow, only distance. The structure he had spent decades stabilizing was finally experiencing the load it had deferred. The outcome was no longer his to control. He had done what engineers do when a building can no longer be saved. He had evacuated what could endure. The day iron stopped obeying was not the birth of a monster. It was the end of a lie. And when the galaxy finally broke under the weight of faith it could not sustain, some would curse Perturabo for his treachery, others would fear him for his precision, and a few, very few, would understand that he had been the only one honest enough to stop pretending endurance was the same as survival. The Iron Warriors did not win. They did not lose. They changed the shape of failure. And in a galaxy that measures victory in bodies and belief, that was the most unforgivable act of all. History would later insist there had been a moment, a single breath in which Perturabo chose treachery and crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Scribes would search for a speech, a proclamation, a dramatic severing of allegiance they could pin the crime to, because history is uncomfortable with processes. It prefers instants. It prefers villains who act in fire rather than men who decide in silence. There was no such moment. The truth was far more damning. Perturabo did not turn against the Emperor in rage or despair. He turned because nothing else remained to be done. The Imperium had removed every mechanism for correction, every channel for honest failure. It had converted belief into infrastructure and obedience into virtue. Once that transformation was complete, collapse became inevitable. The only variable left was how much would be lost when it came. Perturabo had chosen containment. As Imperial forces moved to isolate the Iron Warriors completely, the Legion's cohesion hardened into something closer to inevitability than loyalty. They did not rally around slogans or vengeance. They rallied around function. Orders were obeyed because they made sense. Retreats were accepted because they preserved strength. Engagements were fought only when objectives justified cost. The Iron Warriors did not need to be convinced. They had lived too long beneath the Imperium's expectations to mistake faith for planning. The first true confrontation between brother legions was brief and deeply unsettling for those who expected fury. Imperial commanders arrived seeking defiance and found absence. Fortress worlds they assumed would fall quickly resisted longer than projected because Iron Warrior infrastructure had never been replaced. Supply depots remained operational only because Iron Warriors had designed them to function without ceremony. Even as the Imperium declared Perturabo a traitor, it continued to rely unknowingly on systems he had built and never documented properly. Iron was still holding the structure together, just no longer for the Emperor. Chaos pressed closer as the war widened, not through invitation but through opportunity. Warp storms intensified along fault lines of belief and desperation. Where Imperial commanders demanded sacrifice without explanation, the warp answered with power without restraint. Entire systems fell into madness not because Perturabo corrupted them, but because the Imperium had taught them that suffering required meaning. Chaos simply provided it. Perturabo watched this with controlled detachment. This was the outcome he had tried to prevent. But prevention had required reform, and reform had been forbidden. He refused to allow the Iron Warriors to become zealots of the warp. Ritual was minimized, excess punished, mutation treated as contamination rather than transcendence. The Legion used the warp as one uses unstable fuel, carefully, sparingly, and with full knowledge that every use left residue. This restraint cost them power others embrace freely. It also preserved something rarer: identity. Perturabo understood that chaos did not destroy empires by force alone. It dissolved distinctions. It replaced structure with appetite. The Iron Warriors would not survive that. They would not become screaming avatars of entropy. If they were damned, they would be damned intact. The Emperor never reached out. No final judgment came from Terra. No explanation. No attempt at reconciliation. The silence that had defined Perturabo's service defined his condemnation as well. In that silence, Perturabo found grim confirmation of everything he had calculated. The Emperor did not correct errors. He replaced tools when they became inconvenient. Perturabo had simply refused replacement. As the war expanded beyond any hope of containment, Perturabo withdrew further from the illusion of control. He no longer believed he could shape the galaxy's fate. That was never his role. His role had always been to understand failure and decide where to stand when it arrived. He chose to stand where endurance might still mean something. Not purity, not victory. Endurance. The Iron Warriors became a force history would never reconcile. Too disciplined to be dismissed as mindless traitors. Too corrupted to be reclaimed as loyalists. They existed in the space between narratives, enforcing their own brutal logic on a galaxy that had abandoned logic entirely. They fought not for the Emperor, not for chaos, but for the preservation of function in a universe increasingly hostile to it. That made them unforgivable. The Imperium could not forgive Perturabo, because forgiveness would require admission. Admission that the structure had been flawed. That belief had replaced engineering. That loyalty had been mistaken for consent. Better to label him monster, architect of ruin, traitor without nuance. Chaos could not claim him either. He would never kneel, never surrender authorship of his actions, never allow his legion to become merely another instrument of appetite. If the warp would touch them, it would do so on iron terms, constrained by discipline rather than desire. This refusal isolated Perturabo more completely than any condemnation ever could. In the end, the day Iron stopped obeying did not mark the birth of new power or the triumph of rebellion. It marked the moment the Imperium lost its last honest mirror, the last primarch who measured its strength without myth, its endurance without faith, its future without illusion. Perturabo did not destroy the Imperium. He proved it could be broken, and in doing so, he revealed the truth the Emperor had never allowed to be spoken aloud, that unity enforced through silence is not unity at all, and that structures built on belief alone do not collapse when attacked. They collapse when the ones holding them up finally let go. That was Perturabo's crime, not treachery, honesty, and the galaxy would bleed for it for 10,000 years.